The Louisiana Territory had been subject of Old World interest for many years before 1803. Explorations and scattered settlements in the 17th and 18th centuries had given France control over the river and title to most of the Mississippi Valley. The first serious disruption of French control over Louisiana came during the 7 Years' War. In 1762, France ceded Louisiana west of the Mississippi River to Spain, and in 1763 transferred virtually all of its remaining possessions in North America to Great Britain. This arrangement, however, proved temporary. French power rebounded under the subsequent military leadership of Napoleon Bonaparte. And on October 1st, 1800, Napoleon induced a reluctant King Charles IV of Spain to agree, for a consideration, to cede Louisiana back to France. King Charles at least gave his verbal assent on the condition that France would never alienate the territory to a third power. With this treaty of retrocession, known as the Treaty of Ildefonso, confirmed on March 21, 1801, would not go only the growing and commercially significant port of New Orleans, but the strategic mouth of the Mississippi River. Reports of the supposed retrocession soon were received by the U.S. government with deep misgivings. During the preceding 12 years, Americans had streamed westward into the valleys of Cumberland, Tennessee, and Ohio rivers. The very existence of these new settlers depended on their right to use the Mississippi River freely and to make transshipment of their exports at New Orleans. By terms of the Treaty of San Lorenzo, Spain, in 1795, had granted to the United States the right to ship goods originating in American ports through the mouth of the Mississippi without paying duty, and also the right of deposit or temporary storage of American goods at New Orleans for transshipment. But in 1802, the effect revoked the right of deposit, and so it was in an atmosphere of growing tension in the West that President Thomas Jefferson was confronted with the prospect of a new, wily, and more powerful keeper of the strategic window to the Gulf of Mexico. Jefferson, troubled by this news, instructed Robert R. Livingston, the U.S. minister at Paris, to take 2 steps. 1. To approach Napoleon's minister, Charles Maurice de Talleyrand, with the object of preventing the retrocession in the event this act had not yet been completed. And 2. To try to purchase at least New Orleans if the property had been transferred from Spain to France. Direct negotiations with Talleyrand, however, appeared to be all but impossible. For months, Livingston had to be content with the tantalizing glimmerings of a possible deal between France and the United States. But even these faded as the news of the Spanish governor's revocation of the right of deposit reached the U.S. minister. With this intelligence, he had good reasons for thinking the worst, that Napoleon Bonaparte may have been responsible for this unfortunate act, and that his next move might be to close the Mississippi River entirely to the Americans. Livingston had but one trump to play, and he played it with a flourish. He made it known that an agreement with Great Britain, after all, best served the interest of his country, and at that particular moment, an Anglo-American agreement was about the least of Napoleon's desires. There are good reasons to believe that French failure in Santo Domingo, the island of Hispaniola, the imminence of renewed war with Great Britain, and financial strategies may have all prompted Napoleon in 1803 to offer for sale to the United States the entirety of the Louisiana Territory. At this juncture, James Monroe arrived in Paris as Jefferson's minister, and even though the 2 American ministers possessed neither instructions nor authority to purchase the whole of Louisiana, the negotiations that followed, with Francois Marquis de Barbé-Marbois, Minister of Treasury, acting for Napoleon, moved swiftly to a conclusion. A treaty was signed on May 2nd, but was antedated to April 30th. By its terms, the Louisiana Territory, in the form France had received it from Spain, was sold to the United States. For its vast domain, the United States agreed to pay $11,250,000 outright and assume claims of its citizens against France in the amount of $3,750,000. Interest payments incidental to the final settlement made up the total price of $27,267,622. Precisely what the United States had purchased was unclear, The wording of the treaty was vague. It did not clearly describe the boundaries. It gave no assurances that the West Florida would be considered a part of Louisiana, nor did it delineate the southwest boundary. The American negotiators were fully aware of this. But before the United States could establish fixed boundaries to Louisiana, there arose a basic question concerning the constitutionality of the purchase. Did the Constitution of the United States provide for an act of this kind? The President, in principle a strict constitutionalist, thought that an amendment to the Constitution might be required to legalize the transaction. But, after consideration and considerable talks, the Senate approved the treaty by a vote of 24-7. The setting of fixed boundaries waited negotiations with Spain and Great Britain. The expiring dispute with Spain over the ownership of West Florida and Texas was finally settled by the purchase of the Floridas from Spain in 1819 and the establishment of a fixed southwest boundary line. This line followed the Sabine River from the Gulf of Mexico to the parallel of 32 degrees north, ran thence due north to the Red River, following this stream to the meridian 100 degrees west, thence north to the Arkansas River, and along this stream to its source, thence north or south, as the case might be, to the parallel of 42 degrees north, and west along this line to the Pacific Ocean. The northern boundary was amicable, established by the Anglo-American Convention in 1818. It established the 49th parallel north between the Lake of the Woods and the Rocky Mountains as the American-Canadian border. The Rocky, then referred to as the Stony Mountains, were accepted as the western limit of the Louisiana Territory, and the Mississippi River considered, for all practical purposes, the eastern boundary of the Great Purchase. Much of the territory turned out to contain rich mineral resources, productive soil, valuable grazing lands, forest, and wildlife resources of inestimable value. Out of this empire was carved in their entirety the states of Louisiana, Missouri, Arkansas, Iowa, North Dakota, South Dakota, Nebraska, Oklahoma. In addition, the area included most of the land in Kansas, Colorado, Wyoming, Montana, and Minnesota.